Hello, everybody. I'm back live again. I'm going to speak to a good friend of mine, Simon Sinek. We had a conversation a few days ago, and I thought it would be really important for more people to hear what we have to say as we speak to each other candidly about what's happening in the world and where we feel that we are, best utilized with our talents, our skills, our network. And so I thought some of the things we're saying feel like they're the kind of things that other people should get a sense of how they can have conversations with their friends and build bridges between different communities, different people. Hi, Simon.
Hey, Alo, how are you? Good to see you.
Very good. How are you doing today?
I'm well. Better
Are
now.
you are you still in LA?
I'm still in LA, yeah.
Yes. Simon is bicoastal in the U.S. here. He's from going back and forth between New York and Los Angeles, but the quarantine has got you in Los Angeles more time
I
now,
have been
right?
here. I've been here for the whole quarantine, yeah.
Yeah. As
You're,
have as have I. As have I.
yeah.
Um, so we were talking a few days ago about everything, about life in general. And as I was mentioning to the folks who are on, I just thought it's important for us to have these conversations, not just between ourselves, but publicly, because I feel like some of the things we're saying could be really helpful, could be instructive, and even it's helpful to me because I learned from you, and I don't want other people to miss that opportunity.
The feeling is mutual. I think that's what we were talking, and I think we both stopped and said we should have recorded this.
Listen, and what really got me was that you have been having um, uh, some communication, some relation to police unions. And I was speaking to you about how the police unions being so very powerful are part of the, huge problem in how policing happens in the US. And I was saying things like saying the word police without limiting it by saying some police.
Right.
And I think that's really important, a really important
Yeah.
part
Yeah,
to
I haven't been talking to the police unions. I've
sorry, the
reached
chiefs.
I've reached out to a couple of chiefs and sheriff and just people in the policing organization, more forward thinking, progressive police chiefs.
Yeah.
And I think we have to, because when we say police are, you know, it
Hmm.
it, it's triggering, like saying that of any group, you know, um, and what it does is it entrenches people. But if we say some police are, then what you'll find is it leaves the door open for the forward-thinking good cops to come forward and say we agree. Um,
Absolutely.
um, but I've been learning a lot. I've been learning a lot. Uh,
Yeah. And so, um, in your, in your learning and in your conversations, have you had, since I talked to you, any conversations with police chiefs?
I have.
So, from what I understand, here in California, and it could be the same way across other states and um, yeah, other counties, the police and cities, the police chief is hired by the mayor here in Los Angeles, at the very least, I know. So that's a position that stands squarely with the mayor. And we saw recently in Atlanta with the most recent murder of Rayshard Brooks by a police officer, um, that the police chief resigned. I'm sure with some 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 pushing from the mayor because perhaps the mayor was going to fire her
Mhm.
anyway. So, um, in your conversations with police chiefs, have you discussed any of the more recent events?
The so amongst the progressive police chiefs, they will freely say that there is a problem in the culture of policing, and that when a new so let me take a step back. If we look at corporate cultures across America, in all corporate cultures, big business, small business, government agencies, corporate culture, we know that corporate cultures have for too many years been going away from good leadership. We talk about leadership vacuums in America. This is why there's a decline of loyalty, decline of engagement, all of these things in corporate America. And now, and I've joked with you, it's embarrassing that I have a career. I talk about trust and cooperation. There should be no demand for my work. But the point is there's a movement in corporate America to re-engage with good leadership and rebuild corporate cultures to engender trust inside the halls of their organizations. That same trend, where not feeling safe at work, bad leadership, all of these things, psychologically safe, was true in policing as well. The problem is the policing as a profession is behind the rest of America in developing their culture. And though culture is discussed in policing, the problem is too many police chiefs don't know what culture is. They don't know how to grab their hands around it. And it's a multifaceted problem, and there needs to be reform on multiple levels. And though the things that people are talking about, the banning, the 8 things, those things are good and important, but they won't change the culture of policing.
Okay, so those you're talking about 8 can't wait, right? Right,
exactly.
Okay. And you're saying that's not going to change the culture of policing.
8 can't wait, and the 8 things are good, and but those 8 things alone will not fundamentally shift the culture of policing from where it is to where it needs to go.
Okay.
Number one is, I think, recruiting, which is, for various reasons, for too long, policing organizations have recruited to a paramilitary ideal. They've positioned themselves as paramilitary organizations. And so what ends up happening is you attract people who like the idea of working in a paramilitary job.
Okay.
It's not a paramilitary job. It's a service of a community job. And so what you want to do is change the manner of recruiting, because you're recruiting the wrong personality type, you're recruiting the wrong kind of people to work in this profession. You want to recruit to a service-mindedness, right? And so, for example, I wrote about one of the police forces in my book, Infinite Game. I wrote about this progressive police force in Castle Rock, Colorado, and that's one of the things that this police chief did. All the recruiting videos for so many police organizations are like guys bashing down doors and wearing, heavy equipment, and that's like 1% of the job.
Right.
It is a part of the job, but it's a very, very small part of the job. And so he started doing recruiting videos of like people talking to people and being nice and like helping them across the street. And guess who it attracts? It attracts people who like that idea of doing that job. So recruiting, the nature of the way that recruiting has to change. The other thing is leadership. And again, you could say this across all corporate America, but it's most significant in policing, given the nature of their job. They have authority. They have the right to take away our lives. Well, not the right. They have the ability to take away our lives and our freedom. I mean, that's a serious responsibility.
Right.
And so leadership in policing organization is barely taught. So you get promoted because you're a high performer, but they don't teach you how to lead. And we see this in corporate America as well. We promote our high performers, even if they're toxic team members, they eventually become toxic leaders. But we don't teach people how to lead. So guess what? They don't know how to lead. If you're an accountant, we give you tons of training so you'll be good at being an accountant. If we make you a leader, we have to teach you how to lead so you'll be good at being a leader. There's very poor leadership training in the policing profession.
Understood.
Another thing that has to change is recognition and rewards. Are they recognizing police? Are they recognizing the police officers who do the right thing? Is there a system to say, hey, you grabbed somebody and pulled them off who you thought was excessive? Good job. Guys, we're celebrating Officer, Stevens today because Officer Stevens did the right thing and lived to our values and saved a life today.
Okay.
Right? That's called recognition and reward. You get the behavior reward. It's also, and this goes to leadership as well, it's a profession with intense peer pressure. So you'll have young folks coming in who want to do the right thing, who believe in policing reform, who signed up to do, because they're young and they have the same idealism as all young people getting jobs today.
Right.
And there's an intense peer pressure in the policing profession that you're either with us or against us. And this is where that thin blue line comes from, where
Yes.
you protect your own. And it's become so bastardized that it's now become dangerous. And again, what ends up happening for those young police officers who come in all starry-eyed and idealistic is because the peer pressure is so intense in a lot of policing organizations, one of two things happens. They succumb to the peer pressure or they quit.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got good young police officers who are quitting or turning to the dark side. And by dark side, I mean not that they're going to be violent, not that they're going to act out, but the point is they won't speak out.
That's right. Okay.
Or they won't, and I don't even mean speak out publicly. I mean, like in the locker room, be like, "Hey, dude, you got to stop that shit."
Yeah, and they won't feel comfortable.
There's no psychological safety.
Right.
And again, that goes back to leadership, because leadership is not providing that psychological safety. And the final thing that has to change is the metrics. Too many police are, and we know this in corporate world, like, when we only reward somebody based on if you hit your financial numbers, but we don't recognize how you're taking care of your people, right?
Yeah.
Well, guess what? They focus all of their attention on hitting numbers. Well, it's okay to have metrics, but the metrics can't be unbalanced. And so too many policing organizations measure the efficacy of an officer based on how many arrests they make and how many tickets they write. So guess what they want to do? Make arrests and write tickets.
Yeah.
The more forward-thinking policing organizations are starting to recognize problem solving. So they would rather an officer solve a problem and write no tickets. So I'll give you an example. Let's say there's a dangerous intersection, right? Disproportionately high number of accidents in that intersection. If you take the metrics of only writing tickets, then an officer is going to stand at that intersection and write a bunch of tickets. But it doesn't solve the problem of stopping the accidents. Whereas the more forward-thinking policing organizations, those cops are going to go, well, we should probably stop the accidents. And they'll do something that police officers never do, call the Department of Transportation and say, hey, there's too many accidents in this intersection. Can we get a traffic light in here?
Right.
And they get rewarded for solving a problem. So if we can change recruiting, leadership training, recognition and reward. So we reward on values, right? And recognize good integrity, high integrity behavior, and change find a better balance of metrics. We'll start to see systemic cultural change in the profession of policing.
Wow. And so when it comes to other economic factors, right? The concept of earning an income, and then the concept of a union that will protect that income. I think there are just more variables to making a reality out of what you're suggesting as being part
without a doubt
the solution, right?
Without a doubt. I mean,
so
yes, this is because of all of the reasons you just mentioned, it becomes even more complicated. Not insurmountable, just complicated. But again, the thing we have to invite is there was I can't remember her name. There's an African-American woman, I can't remember her name, who is deathly afraid of the police. And so what she did was she invited some police officers to come to her house for tea.
Did you see this online? Is it a...
No, a friend of mine told me about it.
Okay.
I can get the name. I can call the friend who told me.
All right, no worries.
And they talked. And she asked questions and she listened. And she served as an example of what policing organizations need to do with their community and what the community need to do with with police. The fact that I talk about tempering our language, saying some police officers, there are some out there who get angry at me like that. And I like to remind them, you can't make peace with your friends. You can only make peace with your enemies.
Yeah.
You know? And if you want to create peace, it requires listening on both sides, but one side has to go first. I don't care which side, right? But one side has to go first. And in this particular case, surprisingly, it was this wonderful woman who said, I'm going to be the listener. And they learned about each other. And they heard and understood where her fear comes from. And she got to meet and see that they're human beings too, and understand where their fear comes from.
Understood.
But there is no question, there are serious and significant problems in many of our policing organizations, but they are fixable.
I believe that they're fixable as well. There's the concept that is being promoted right now that I understand and I agree with is, but the hashtag is defund the police. What it means ultimately isn't necessarily to abolish police. I think that's what people hear when they hear defund the police.
Let's be honest, it's bad branding.
They think if there's no money, then there's no paychecks, then there's no police. But ultimately, it's about refunding the people or redirecting resources that will make the police not so necessary in terms of numbers of police officers, not in terms of getting rid of the actual department and not having any police.
Right. It's bad branding because it triggers for some people, and the police are burdened with more responsibilities than one group should ever have, and it's layers upon layers. Years ago, across the United States, probably starting in the 1980s, there was tremendous defunding for mental health. Exactly.
Absolutely.
And so people who were experts in dealing with mental health problems were defunded, and they told the police, you deal with it. The police are not experts in dealing with mental health.
I'm going to do some research to find out what was the impetus for the defunding of mental health. And my conspiracy theory radar is suggesting police unions.
I don't know the answer. But that job should never have been given to police in the first place. And I think many officers would agree that that's not where their talents lie, and that's not really what they want to do, and they would rather other people who are expert at those jobs do it. But we just kept defunding things to save money all over the place and just dumping it on cops, and we're seeing some of the results of that. So when we talk about defunding the police, we talk about reapportioning certain funds to go to people who are better equipped to do some of these jobs. That would be one of them. Domestic violence is another one. What it also means, you know about the case of Camden, New Jersey?
I heard that New Jersey had a full restructuring of their police department.
What Camden, New Jersey did was, it goes back to my recruiting thing, but they actually were even more extreme in how they did it. Camden, New Jersey fired all of their cops, all of them, and made them reapply for their jobs. Under
new requirements.
Again, non-paramilitary, all of these things. They made them reapply. They did not hire everyone back. But the ones who got hired back had a higher level of, all the things that we want to see in police officers. And we saw, not only did we see crime plummet in what was a historically dangerous area, but we saw relationships with the police increase.
Okay. So then the reporting of crime in a historically dangerous area could have been misreported, potentially. Or
it's if you have the wrong people. Here's a great example, right?
Right. If you're the hammer and the nail.
It's hammer and the nail to some degree, but it's also how an officer chooses to respond to a situation, right? So I'll give you an example of the United Kingdom versus many cities in the United States. So in the United States, as huge crowds started to appear, and unfortunately some rioters who joined, we saw police officers show up in riot gear. And even before there was violence, they showed up in riot gear prepared for the violence. And they showed up with helmets and clubs and shields and stood there, right? Now the UK had demonstrations as well, and the UK also deployed their police officers, and all of the cops had their helmets off and their shields on the ground leaning against their legs. So it says, if it gets out of hand, we've got the right equipment, but we're not showing up, you know, treating protesters as if they're violent. And they stood there with their helmets off, which is incredibly disarming. You can see their faces, they're human, right? And so there's a mentality that when you show up for something, how you respond to it and how people respond back. And it's do I see, and by the way, it goes to leadership, right? Which is, do I see protesters as potential rioters, or am I showing up to protect protesters from rioters? It's a different mentality. Am I showing up to serve the people who are protesting peacefully?
This is the issue a lot of folks conflate, and the media does it on purpose almost, to conflate rioter with protester, looter
and looter, yeah.
Protester.
And you taught me this, and I've used it multiple times since you taught me this. Yeah,
I think, and in my estimation, in the way that I like to look at it, if you're a protester, that's one thing. When you cross the line to becoming a rioter, you're a completely other thing. And not only that, there are just people who are not there to protest. There are people who are just there to riot. And especially with this pandemic, a lot of young folks have angst, and they want to be out, and they want to kick up dust. And it's not proper, but it happens. And at the same time, there are certainly some counterinsurgent kind of people with totally different purposes and missions that want to create anarchy purposefully. So they co-opt a protest moment to engage in their activity.
And I think there's examples of that happening in every protest. This is not unique.
I'm sure of it. This is it's one of those times where we're all, I think, so ready to engage in life the way that we knew before, but it's just impossible because of COVID-19, because of the quarantine. And then we're seeing, on our social media and on television, on the news, so many horrendous acts that are happening, whether it's the violence in the rioting, or it's the violence happening from police on human beings, or it's violent ideologies that are being espoused because people have no filter, or haven't come to the sense of their humanity yet. And it is all triggering in really really hard ways. I mean, how do you see a transformation, an ideological transformation in the greater public coming from our present circumstances? Do you see it being possible? Are we in echo chambers with our social media, or are people being enlightened by social media?
I mean,
yes, and both.
Yes, and I mean, it's a little bit like modern news, which is we tune into the one that we agree with. Ted Koppel said this many years ago. He said we used to give people the news they needed, whether they wanted it or not. Now we give people the news they want, whether they need it or not. And our news media is more polarized than it's ever been. And by the way, they're all to blame. We think the one that we watch is the right one, and the other one is the bad one. And everything's become so binary, black and white. Like you're either good or you're bad. You're either right or you're wrong. You're either with us or you're against us. You're either speaking up or you're complicit. And the world is just not like that. The world is not binary like that. And I think until we can recognize that the truth lies in the middle, that not until we can feel heard and we can hear. And this goes to accountability, right? The policing organizations need to take accountability for the state of their cultures now and work to rectify. Individual police officers who violate the values of a good policing organization need to be held accountable. And that doesn't necessarily mean we're talking grand crimes and prison sentences. We're talking about minor infractions that build and build and build and build. You know, many of these police officers who should have cases against them or do have cases against them, very often, Derek Chauvin, a great example, have a history of complaints against them. And so if they're not held to account when they're junior, when their complaints are minor or less severe, then what you end up is 10 years later, somebody leaning on somebody else's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Yeah. And so, you know, accountability is important in any organization. So as a whole, policing, I think, can take accountability for the state of affairs. It's a good thing. Taking accountability, by the way, is about vulnerability. It's very difficult for any individual to say, I made a mistake, or I need help, or I'm struggling.
It's just not in our culture. That's not in our culture. America teaches.
And so if it's difficult for us as individuals to do that, now amplify that to an organization, for an entire profession to say, we've made mistakes, we need help, we're struggling. And by the way, there's tons of people who want to help, but you got to let us in.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned accountability, and right now the House of Representatives has proposed a bill, a justice reform bill, that is attempting to put into place some of these transformations that need to happen within the policing in the United States. And one of those also goes to the highest court of the land, the Supreme Court, which has a doctrine called qualified immunity. And this doctrine, created by the Supreme Court, it's not a law. It's not from law. It's an interpretation of law and a practice that has created a precedent, a methodology of precedent that qualifies police to be immune from accountability on the civil side. And on the criminal side, district attorneys have a relationship with police and are reticent to prosecute or charge because they need to have a good relationship or need to have a relationship with police. So
they don't want to create a conflict of interest.
Right. And so I think there's already a conflict there.
Yeah.
So we've got, on one hand, on the criminal side, no prosecutions and no charging of police for misconduct, and on the civil side, no prosecution or charging because there's just there's no way to do it. The doctrine of qualified immunity blocks it. Right. So my assumption, and the assumption of legislators is that removing this loophole to accountability will create a deterrent for the kind of misconduct that we see. Do you believe that a deterrent that high up will work?
Good cops don't like bad cops, because good cops believe that bad cops are making it more difficult for all of them to do their job, right? That's why I insist that we say that some police XXX, you know, because, and I'm tired of, by the way, police chiefs standing up and saying a few bad apples, blah, 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 most cops are good cops. Like, we know that. That's not the problem. The problem is structural. And the good news is that's changeable. To your point of qualified immunity, I have to believe, and I don't know the history of it, but I have to believe, at least I hope, that the original intention, because like it's kind of like people in government, you can't sue them for things they say on the floor of the Congress or the Senate, and for good reason, is because you want them to speak openly, right? You want them, right? So I have to believe that something like this existed long ago because you wanted cops to be able to do their jobs effectively and not hold back, reticent, not do anything for fear of blowback. And by the way, I know stories of where that happens, that where the public suffers as a result. So for example, and this goes back many years, a cop told me that years and years ago, if he caught kids drinking, underage kids drinking, he'd make them dump the beer on their heads and he'd take them home. And he said now he can't do that because he's too afraid that he'll get sued, and so now he has to arrest them. So so I if it was those kinds of little things that qualified immunity was trying to protect, unfortunately, it was maybe a good idea performed badly that's got completely out of hand and is now creating a safe space for abhorrent behavior, no accountability. And when there's no accountability, it allows for abhorrent behavior to manifest and multiply. So I agree with you. I mean, I think it's a bad idea, this qualified immunity, that you can't hold people accountable for their actions.
Yeah. And it's not absolutely necessary to have, in my opinion, the doctrine of qualified immunity. But some of the arguments for it is that, it will open up, it'll become an undue burden on the municipality and on the police and on the court system. That is the large and overarching argument argument for it. They're saying that if if we abolish qualified immunity, then everybody's going to be suing the police and state agents.
Yeah, I mean, this is the old floodgates argument. Like, where's the line? Well, there is a line, and there are multiple ways to solve the line. We can be creative, maybe legislation can put the line in somewhere.
Yeah. So that's what's happening. So one, the Amash Presley bill put forth is asking to abolish qualified immunity wholesale. The Justice Reform bill that the Congressional Black Caucus has put forth is suggesting limitations that are to, law enforcement, police officers, and along with a series of other things like, banning chokeholds and other forms of excessively abusive restraint or actions. I think altogether they all make sense. It's important to have accountability, and that's a remedy for the civil side, because in the case of George Floyd, if he was the breadwinner for his family, then his murder makes it a situation where his family is now going to be looking for some way to pay their rent, buy their groceries, and so the remedy for that would have been to be able to sue the police officer to be made whole for his misconduct. In the absence of that, there's no remedy. So then they would potentially want to sue the municipality, the city that hired this officer. But there's another doctrine called the Monell Doctrine, which basically does the same thing and creates an immunity shield around the city from having to pay. Quite often, some of these things get settled out of court.
Yeah, I was going to say, but people sue police forces all the time, and municipalities are paying out, and you know much more about this than I do, billions of dollars a year.
Right.
In these,
quite often they settle out.
To settle out. So when they're talking about undue burden, how about the billions of dollars that are going to existing lawsuits?
Yeah.
Isn't that an undue burden?
This is where it makes sense for the mayor or whoever is hiring the police chief to be completely aware and completely upfront about how policing is happening and to get ahead of it and be in control of it. Here's the rub. In New York, where there are 20,000 police, New York City, in Los Angeles, where there are 9,000, the relationship between an official a candidate who is wanting to become mayor, looking for votes, can find 20,000 free votes if they are in a position where they have a good relationship with the police union in New York City, or 9,000 free votes if they have a good relationship with the police union in Los Angeles. So they're stuck between a rock and a hard place, because this is how they got into office. How are they going to make decisions that are counter to the alliances that got them there?
Yeah.
We've got some real tough politics.
A mayor is a political position.
Yeah, absolutely.
And by the way, policing itself also, what I'm starting to learn is how political policing is. For example, you have different industry organizations. You have multiple police chiefs organizations, so competing industry organizations. You have a sheriff's organization. They don't necessarily get along. They don't necessarily help each other.
Highway patrol.
You know, but we're talking at a sort of like industry level. If one sheriff or police chief were to put out a statement of accountability listing the reforms and like the things we talked about, they would be, especially if it's a sheriff, which is an elected position, they would be accused of grandstanding for votes. Like, the splinters are not just like the community and the police. The splinters are everywhere.
Internal. Right.
They're everywhere. That makes it more complicated for the forward-thinking, progressive police chiefs to actually do the right thing. So how do we help the progressive, because they understand their profession better than we do. They understand how it works internally, and they understand what it takes to make the changes necessary. Of course, and they're open to outside counsel, the progressive police chiefs. You know, Art Acevedo in Houston has been very outspoken. I would consider him up there. And so the question is how do we help the progressive, forward-thinking police chiefs? How do we give them the top cover and the support to sometimes push their mayors, you know, to sometimes influence their mayors to do the right thing rather than the politically expedient thing?
Right. That to me sounds like the very difficult question to answer, because we have, like you said, a force of a culture that needs to be transformed first.
Culture has to be transformed.
Of course, the police chief has the power to make a lot of decisions and make a lot of changes, but there is a cultural force as well. And you know, I wonder if to some extent there is, you know, there's a real existential fear about their safety for speaking out and going against. You know, I think if there's an existential fear for my brothers and sisters in the inner city, then I don't see why, you know, within the force there is no fear of retaliation.
Or at the very minimum for their jobs.
Yeah.
And they too have families and all the rest of it. And so the same fears, you know, exist. I mean, I'm so glad you and I are having this conversation, because I think what we're talking about is the complications and the nuances and the shades of gray that make this, because if we keep it binary, then both sides entrench and no progress is made.
Yeah. You mentioned early in the conversation the four things that
I would make it 5. I would add accountability in there too.
5 things that to help change the culture. I would love to bring those to the discussions with the activists who are calling for transformation.
Great idea.
So that can be part of the discussion when we're talking about defund the police. That's part of the conversation. It's not just defunding. Let's also reform. And here are some of the suggestions. Would you please share that with me in text form?
Yeah, for sure.
And thank you so much for joining me to have this discussion. I really believe that it's beneficial to anyone who hears you speak about leadership and how to transform organizations from within. And this is one that is extremely prescient, matters to all of us right now. So thank you.
Hey, thanks, Alo. And I'm always wiser after I talk to you. I really appreciate. I really appreciate.
By the way, the song made my album. So So I don't know
I can't
how
wait.
long ago was this? 2 years, 3 years ago, I was in New
Something like
York. We
that.
had Simon took me to one of his favorite restaurants, and he told me a story that led to me writing a song the next day. I had a recording session.
Right.
That song, I wasn't sure if it was going to make the album. It made the album, and I think it's going to be my anchor single. So after I drop all my singles before I end the album cycle, the label really loves it. They want to make it
Well,
the anchor
you
single.
sent me the demo 2 days after we had the conversation, and I've illegally played it for friends, and everybody loves that song.
Great.
Everybody
Good.
loves that song. I can't wait. Did you remix it, or is it basically the same?
It's been remixed from what you've heard. Maybe a version of what you've heard will eventually make it out, but I love the way that I've remixed it.
I can't wait to hear it. I can't wait to hear it.
I'll share it right away.
Thanks.
Thank you, Simon. Good
Thanks,
to see you.
Alan.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye bye.